Discovering breakthrough therapies for Alzheimer's requires investment, and here to discuss what the future may hold for Alzheimer's research is Brent Vaughan, CEO of Biotech startup Cognito Therapeutics. Brent, you have been in this business for a while. You're in the private sector side of this. I'm so pleased we get a chance to talk to you. Tell us about your, I'm reading right now about positive phase 2 results from a device-delivered Alzheimer's. Tell us how you're seeing what is really changing in the Alzheimer's terrain.
Thanks so much for having me on today. It's an exciting topic and obviously a huge unmet need. I think that just building on some of the comments from the last two speakers, right? We increasingly understand that Alzheimer's is a very heterogeneous disease. We see multiple different therapeutic platforms now that are going forward to try to really start to move the needle here. And I think there's been huge focus, rightfully so, on antibody-based therapies. The Biogen drug Aduhelm, Lilly, one of the sponsors for this event, has their donanemab drug that has been granted breakthrough designation and is going forward. And I think that one of the things that we think is exciting is that there is a whole new category of therapeutic interventions, and we're lucky enough to be leading the charge in this space, looking at non-pharmacological ways of actually being able to try to move the needle and change the outcomes for Alzheimer's patients.
I guess the other thing I would ask for you is when you kind of look at the broad side of therapies that are coming online, are there things that the policy community should be doing? Are there missing gaps in funding that you think are very key to kind of continue to have the, we just talked to Dr. Carrillo and she was praising Roy Blunt, who I understand Roy Blunt is going to be on, talk to me later, his good friend, move the funding level of this from $600 million under his tenure to now above $3 billion. But are the right parts of this puzzle being funded that make it, I guess, I hate the word safe, but make it easier for the private sector to do what you're doing?
I think it's increasingly moving in the right direction, right? I think, oftentimes in the private sector, maybe we don't give enough credit to where government and legislative bodies are actually doing the right things. I think the breakthrough designation is a perfect example of that. Here at Cognito, we were granted breakthrough designation for our non-pharmacological platform to slow the progression and treat Alzheimer's disease. And so that is similar to the breakthrough designation that Lilly received for donanemab. And so I think when you see breakthrough designation being used and being, I think, used quite correctly in this space, the criteria for breakthrough with the FDA are a novel therapy that addresses an unmet medical need that has chronic or debilitating consequences. And so it's a great avenue and a great tool that the FDA has made available. And so I think being able to have more companies or more therapeutic approaches like ours, more therapeutic approaches like what Lilly has, being able to move down the breakthrough path, I think that's quite helpful because ultimately we're quite aligned. We're trying to get safe and effective treatments into the hands of more patients sooner. And so I think that, certainly we could do more in this space. It is one of the largest unmet medical needs and continues to grow, both in the US as well as other countries. And so more obviously helps, but giving the heterogeneity of what we see in this disease that the last two speakers have spoken about, right. Being able to look at different therapeutic modalities at Cognito, instead of looking at antibodies like Lilly and Biogen and some of the others, we actually are really trying to turn the space on its head a little bit, if you would. When we look at the brain, we understand that electricity is the fundamental currency of the brain. And when we look at Alzheimer's, we see very pronounced disruption in electrical activity across the brain. And so we've decided to take this from a very different approach. Instead of giving drugs that change A beta and other protein pathologies, and then ultimately wanting to see that matriculate into changes in electrical activity and outcomes, we come at it from the other end. We actually look at some of the areas of brainwave activity that seem to be missing or depressed in Alzheimer's patients, and we've shown that we can modulate or augment that, and that in turn pushes at this disease from the other side and starts changing some of that protein pathology. And in our phase 2 data, it's shown that in our phase 2 studies that these patients had a much, much slower rate of progression for Alzheimer's disease.
Let's bracket the FDA question, because I received from a knowledgeable person, and it affected the way I was talking about it, because I assume Dr. Zerhouni is a great guy, did this, but he talked about this new drug, Aduhelm, receiving conditional approval. But my understanding is they received not conditional approval, but actually accelerated approval. And the conditional approval is something that basically is a European function. But over here, this received real approval, and I think I say conditional approval because that's what Dr. Zerhouni said, but I want to tell our audience that Aduhelm has been approved, and it's a big deal. Words matter, and I want to make sure that everyone knows this, but your product has received FDA breakthrough device designation, and I'm just interested because the FDA is talked about, and I have a good conversation coming up on the FDA, but I think that the question I have is the FDA playing is it leaning in on these challenges? Do you feel as if they're an active, positive partner? Are you impressed with what's happened with Aduhelm and what we've seen come through? And what is your prognosis for the field and the interaction with the FDA on other promising therapies?
Yeah, well, I would caveat it to say that it is a large field, and so I'm not sure that any one person gets to make a prognosis on it, as it were. But I think that the Aduhelm story is not over yet. There's been a number of kind of twists and turns along the path when they were able to receive their approval, and then they've certainly had some issues around safety and acceptance in the marketplace. But I think that this is actually an example of when the FDA is trying to help promote innovation in a space, right? I think it's been mentioned a number of times today that prior to Aduhelm, it's been 18 years since the last approval, right? I was working in the pharmacological side of working with a company developing novel Alzheimer's drug at that time. My children were just born. They're now going off to college, right? That's how long it's been since we've seen an approval in this space. And so I think the FDA's ability to embrace an innovative challenge, we saw two things there, right? We saw a approval for a novel therapeutic in this space, first one in 18 years. And we saw the first approval for a therapeutic intervention that is targeted towards disease modification, not just treating symptoms, but trying to change the underlying etiology of this disease progression. And that's very exciting because companies like Cognito, we focus on using neuromodulation and changing the electrical activity across the brain, but we're targeting the same thing. We're trying to change the underlying disease progression and not just try to address some of the symptoms. And so I think if you look at the FDA signaling that they're open to innovation in this space, and for the first time signaling and giving a nod towards a therapy that's going after a disease-modifying mechanism of action in this space, I think it makes it one of the most exciting times to be in the Alzheimer's space. And I think the FDA needs to balance safety versus efficacy, but they also need to balance the unmet need and the demand from the patient advocacy side for seeing some movement in this space. And I think they've done a good job trying to balance that.
Let me ask you finally, Brent, and perhaps an unfair question for someone who is as smart as you, a scientist and innovator in this area. The question I have is, when you kind of look back and you look at the data and the incidence of Alzheimer's, we see yet again the same pattern you see across America's health spectrum, which is it is hitting certain communities, particularly Black and Hispanic communities, disproportionately. And I don't know what the causal driver is there, but I do know that polling shows, particularly in the Black community, that there is a lack of trust in the healthcare system, creating products that will either work for them or that they will be excluded. And I'm just interested in whether, as you kind of run in the circles here, are we not doing something on the trust front that we should be? Are we not doing something on the diversity and inclusion front so that we get a more holistic inclusion as we talk about this? So maybe that's an unfair question to you because it's a really social and cultural question, but I do think it matters because there are a lot of folks out there that somehow are being hit by this differently than say, my family members.
Yeah, so I think that two thoughts to address that. Number one, from the more narrow Alzheimer's lens, right? When Dr. Correa was speaking a few minutes ago, she talked about funding of over 60 different clinical studies out there right now. It is it's actually quite competitive to enroll patients in a phase 3 Alzheimer's study. We are launching 2 phase 3 studies, one in Alzheimer's and one in MCI later this year. And it's competitive. So when you have a competitive situation for enrolling, it actually, I think, helps with diversity and inclusion, because you're trying to throw the net as widely as possible and bring in as many patients. And so I think that ultimately helps patients. It helps drive towards greater inclusion and diversity. I think that this is a little afield from some of the other things we've talked about. And I guess the other part of my answer is also a little bit afield. But I think if you look at what's happened over the last few decades, and this not specific to Alzheimer's whatsoever, but we've seen an increasing disintermediation of the patient primary care physician relationship. And I think that you see the ripple effect of this through anti-vaccine, through so many different threads that have come through the healthcare discussion and healthcare debate. And I think as we have increasingly disintermediated and weakened that bond between primary care physician and patient, where many patients don't have a primary care physician that they know by name, I think that undermines trust. And I think in the world of healthcare, whether you're a provider, whether you are developing novel therapeutics like we do at Cognito, or even if you're in the payer side, trust is the foundation of any brand that you can build in healthcare. And I think we're seeing some of the ripple effect from that.
Are you in this for the long run?
This is what I do. This is what I've been doing ever since I got out of school. Healthcare is not for everyone, but what I tell people in the company, not everybody has to be passionate about moving the needles in Alzheimer's, just the people that work here.
Really, really great story. Thank you so much for sharing it. Thanks again to Brent Vaughan, CEO of Cognito Therapeutics. I hope you'll come back. I love seeing folks do what you're doing out there, and I hope you'll come back and talk to us again.
Thank you so much for having me.